She used the tradesman's entrance for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She counted, not out of bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury she had never been able to afford, but because she was the kind of woman who noticed things. The angle of light through a greenhouse glass at 4 in the afternoon. The particular silence of a house when its owner has just left it. The small, precise ways in which a place tells you exactly where you stand within it. The tradesman's entrance told her very clearly. She went in anyway. Every morning for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, Sira Vassal carried her bag through the side gate, past the kitchen garden, down the narrow path that smelled of cold stone and last night's coal, and through the door that the servants used and the family did not. She learned the names of the kitchen maids. She learned which step on the back staircase creaked and which floorboard in the corridor shifted underfoot. She learned the whole interior geography of Blackwell Manor through its service passages, the way you learn a city by its alleyways thoroughly, practically, without any of the grandeur. She did not learn the Duke's name for 3 weeks. No one thought to tell her, and she did not think to ask. He was simply the Duke, a presence, an absence, a pair of boots she occasionally heard on the floor above the library where she worked. He did not learn her name for 2 years. This is the story of what happens in the space between those two facts, and what it costs, and what it makes, and what a man discovers about himself when someone else's name is finally said aloud in a room full of people and lands in his chest like something he should have known all along. The morning Sira Vassal arrived at Blackwell Manor, the sky was the particular flat gray of the English north in October, not threatening, not dramatic, simply present, the way northern weather is always simply present, as though it has never felt the need to explain itself to anyone. She had been traveling for 11 days. Before that, 6 weeks in London settling her father's affairs, the paperwork of a dead man's life, which is its own particular kind of labor, requiring a specific combination of grief and practicality that she had not known she was capable of until she had no choice but to be. Before that, 3 months in Bucharest, watching her father diminish by degrees in the way that brilliant men sometimes do, as though the body finally grows tired of containing so much. She was 24 years old. She spoke 5 languages, had co-authored 2 papers on alpine flora that had been published in scientific journals in Vienna and Paris, and could identify 312 plant species by their leaf structure alone. She had £11 and 4 to her name. The money from the sale of her father's collection, his life's work, 40 years of specimens and notes and correspondence with the greatest botanical minds in Europe, had gone to his debts. What remained after the debts was the collection itself. The notebooks, the unpublished manuscripts, the seeds and pressed samples, and the half-finished masterwork he had been writing for the last decade and had not, quite, managed to complete. And a letter. The letter had come from a solicitor in London, 6 months before her father died, an offer from the Duke of Blackwell to purchase the collection in its entirety. A good offer. A generous offer, the solicitor had said, with the particular emphasis of a man who wanted her to understand that this was not the moment for sentiment. Her father had accepted. The terms included a provision. The collection required expert organization and cataloging before it could be properly housed. The Duke's estate had a library and a botanical garden that needed significant work. Sira, as her father's assistant and the person who knew the collection best, was offered a short-term position, 3 months, possibly 6, to oversee the transition. Short-term, the solicitor had said. That had been 18 months ago. She was still here. The hired coach deposited her at the front gate of Blackwell Manor at 9:30 in the morning. The estate was, and she was not a woman easily impressed by things that were merely large, impressive. The house itself sat at the end of a long gravel avenue lined with lime trees that had been old when the current Duke's grandfather was born, their branches meeting overhead in the particular way of trees that have been growing toward each other for so long they have simply decided to become one thing. Beyond the house, visible even from the gate, The grounds rolled away into what she could tell, from this distance, had once been a serious garden and was now something considerably more ambiguous. She would deal with that later. She walked up the avenue. The coach had not been invited through the gates, and she had not asked, understanding instinctively that the kind of guest who is met at the gate is a different category of guest from the kind who drives to the door, and arrived at the front steps with her large bag over one shoulder and her father's leather satchel, worn soft at the buckles, over the other. She set them down. She smoothed her coat, which was good quality but several years old and had spent 11 days on various coaches and did not entirely look it. She straightened her back, which was a thing she did automatically in moments of uncertainty, the physical equivalent of a deep breath. And she knocked. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent a great deal of her life waiting for her father to finish a thought, for weather to change, for seeds to germinate, for the particular slow processes of living things to do what they were going to do in the time they were going to do it. Impatience, she had concluded long ago, was mostly a failure of attention. If you were paying close enough attention, waiting was never empty. She was paying attention now. The front door of Blackwell Manor was painted black, she noted, and recently you could tell by the particular depth of the color, not yet faded by a single winter. The brass fittings were well maintained. The stone of the steps was worn in a specific pattern that told you something about how people moved through this entrance, where they paused, where they hurried. The flower beds flanking the steps were, she catalogued this with the automatic precision of someone who cannot help it, severely neglected. What had been planted there was still alive, just, but unhappy. 3 years without proper attention at a guess, possibly 4. She was still looking at the flower beds when the door opened. He came out rather than a servant coming to the door, which was the first unexpected thing. She knew immediately that it was him, not from anything she had been told, because she had been told almost nothing about the Duke of Blackwell beyond what the solicitor's letters contained, which was very little. She knew it the way you know certain things, from the way he occupied the space of the doorway, the way he moved through it as though the question of whether he belonged there had genuinely never occurred to him. He was perhaps 30, dark-coated, dark-haired, the kind of tall that is functional rather than decorative. A face that was not handsome in the conventional way but was arresting in a more useful one. Specific, angular, the face of someone who is usually thinking about something. He was thinking about something now. He had papers in one hand and the expression of a man interrupted mid-thought, which meant he was looking at her without quite seeing her. She looked back at him steadily. Behind him, the steward appeared, a precise, gray-haired man who took in the situation in approximately 1 second and began, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been managing the complications of a large estate for many years, to manage it. He stepped forward and said something to the Duke low, quick, the kind of communication that happens between a man and his steward over years until it barely requires words. She caught the botanist and the collection and this morning. The Duke looked at her again. This time he saw her. She watched him assess, coat, bag, accent not yet spoken but somehow already implied, the absence of a carriage, the presence of soil still on her boots from where she had stepped off the path to look more closely at what was happening to the ground cover beneath the lime trees. It took perhaps 3 seconds. Then he looked at the steward. The steward turned to her. "If you'll follow me, miss," he said, with perfect courtesy and perfect neutrality, "I'll show you to the entrance you'll be using." The tradesman's entrance was around the side of the house, down a narrow path, through a gate in the kitchen garden wall. It was not a bad entrance. It was clean, functional, protected from the wind by the garden wall, and opened directly onto the back corridor that led most efficiently to the library. She understood all of this. She understood also what it meant. She followed the steward through the kitchen garden, which was in better condition than the flower beds. Someone was paying attention here, at least, and through the door, which was solid oak and opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges. She noted the hinge oil, the cleanliness of the stone floor inside, the warmth from the kitchen at the end of the corridor. She noted everything. The steward showed her to the library, which was, and here she stopped assessing for a moment and simply stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone who has just seen something that requires their full attention. The library was magnificent. Not in a decorated, curated way. It was magnificent in the way of rooms that have been genuinely lived in and genuinely used, where the books are arranged by the logic of a mind rather than the logic of appearance, where the furniture is good but worn, where the windows are tall enough to flood the whole space with the flat northern light. Her father's collection had already been partially unloaded, crates along one wall, her father's notebooks stacked on the long central table with the careful reverence of someone who had understood, at least, that they were important. She set down her bag. She set down the satchel. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the work in front of her, months of it, maybe more, the careful unpacking and cataloging and cross-referencing of a life's worth of knowledge, and she felt, for the first time since her father died, something that was not grief and not exhaustion, something that felt like purpose. Fine, she thought, the same word she had thought at the side gate at the tradesman's door on the narrow path through the kitchen garden. Fine, I have work to do. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook behind the library door, rolled up her sleeves and began. 2 days later, she was deep in the third crate when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately. People came and went in the library. The steward, occasionally a housemaid to light the fire, once a young footman who had apparently been sent to determine whether she needed anything and had been so unprepared for the sight of a woman surrounded by open crates and loose manuscripts that he had simply stood in the doorway for a moment before retreating. She finished the note she was making, cross-referencing a seed packet with the corresponding entry in her father's 1809 journal, and then looked up. The Duke of Blackwell was standing at the far bookshelf, pulling out a volume with the ease of a man in his own library, which he was. He had not apparently noticed her. She watched him for a moment. He found what he was looking for, a slim, dark-spined book, something mathematical from the angle of it, and turned. He saw her. There was a pause, not an awkward one exactly, more the pause of two people who have both been caught doing something perfectly reasonable and are briefly recalibrating. She was sitting on the floor between two open crates with ink on her fingers and her hair doing something she was not going to think about. He was holding a book on mathematics and apparently reassessing his understanding of who was currently in his library. She met his eyes. He looked at her for a moment, that same assessing quality she had noticed at the front door, but slower this time, less certain of its conclusion. Then he looked at the crates, at the notebooks spread across the table, at the careful organizational system she had begun to impose on what had been, when she arrived, a state of considerable chaos. Something moved in his expression. Then he turned and walked back to the door. At the threshold he stopped. She watched his back. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he left. She looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked down at the notebook in her lap, found her place, and continued. Outside in the corridor she heard his footsteps, unhurried, certain, move away down the hall and disappear. She did not know then what that pause meant. She would think about it later, much later, when she was counting other things. The library had a rhythm, and Sierra found it within the first week. Early morning was best. The light came in from the east windows at an angle that was almost useful, almost warm, and the house was quiet in the particular way of large houses before they wake up, when the only sounds were the fire settling and the distant, purposeful movements of the kitchen staff beginning their day. She arrived before anyone else, let herself in through the tradesman's entrance. She had been given a key on the third day, slid under her door by the steward with no accompanying note, which she had taken as the Manor's version of a welcome, and had 2 hours of uninterrupted work before the house filled with noise. Those 2 hours were the best part of her day. She worked through her father's notebooks in chronological order, which was the only order that made sense. He had been a man who thought in time, who understood plants as things that existed in seasons and years and decades, and his notes reflected that. Each entry cross-referenced with others, each observation part of a longer argument that he had been building, she realized slowly, for most of his adult life. The masterwork. He had called it simply the book when he spoke of it, never with a title, always with the particular reverence of a man who understood that naming something too early was a way of limiting it. It was to be his complete account of alpine flora across the European continent, 40 years of field work, correspondence, specimen collection, and analysis, synthesized into something that would, he had believed, change the way the field understood the relationship between altitude and adaptation. He had not finished it. He had come close. Closer than she had realized going through the notebooks now. The argument was nearly complete, the evidence largely assembled. What remained was the final synthesis, the last third of the manuscript which existed in fragments and notes, and the shorthand she had spent 24 years learning to read. She could finish it. She had understood this by the end of the second week with a clarity that arrived not as excitement but as something more serious, the specific weight of a responsibility you have chosen to accept. She could finish it, which meant she was going to. She wrote to the solicitor extending her stay. He wrote back with a figure. She accepted it. Nobody asked the Duke. The Manor had its own rhythm too, and she learned that within the first month. The Duke was not always there. He divided his time between Blackwell and London, and his London periods could last anywhere from a week to 6 weeks, the pattern determined by some social calendar she had no access to and no particular interest in. When he was in residence, the house shifted slightly, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way weather shifts before a front arrives. The staff moved with more precision. Doors were opened at particular hours. The dining room, which she passed on her way to the back stairs, was lit in the evenings rather than dark. She learned his schedule the way she learned everything in this house, through observation, through the accumulation of small details, through paying the kind of attention that most people don't bother with because they don't understand yet that small details are where everything true lives. He rose early. She knew this because she occasionally heard him in the corridor above the library at an hour when the rest of the house was still quiet, unhurried footsteps, the sound of a door, the distant suggestion of movement. He went to the stables before breakfast, which she knew because the head groom, a talkative Yorkshireman named Fell who had taken a friendly interest in her botanical work, mentioned it once without being asked. He read late. She knew this because the light in his study, visible from the corner of the kitchen garden, if you happened to be there in the evening, which she occasionally was, checking on the beds she had begun to rehabilitate, stayed on long after the rest of the house went dark. She did not think of these things as knowing him. She thought of them as knowing the house. The kitchen garden was not, strictly speaking, her responsibility. Her position covered the library, the botanical collection, and the walled greenhouse at the far end of the grounds, which had been her father's particular interest, and contained several species of considerable rarity and considerable neglect. The kitchen garden was the domain of Mossop, the head gardener, who was 70 years old, philosophically opposed to change, and had initially regarded Sierra's presence on his grounds with the specific wariness of a man who has seen many things come and go, and has developed a policy of waiting to see which category they fall into. By the end of the 3rd month, he had decided she fell into the acceptable category. This was communicated not through words, but through the leaving of tools near the greenhouse door on mornings when she needed them, and the occasional appearance of a recommendation, a variety of soil amendment, a suggestion about drainage scratched on a piece of paper and slid under the greenhouse door without any indication of its origin. She responded in kind. Notes on the greenhouse plants that might be relevant to the kitchen garden. Observations about the east-facing beds that she had noticed from the library windows. Once, a small packet of seeds from her father's collection, alpine strawberry, suited to the north-facing wall, left on the potting bench without comment. Mossop planted them the following week. This was how she made her way in the manor, not through any formal recognition, but through the slow, patient accumulation of usefulness. The kitchen maids learned that she would not report their occasional unauthorized use of the greenhouse as a quiet place to sit. The footman who had stood frozen in the library doorway eventually learned to bring her tea without being asked. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, a formidable woman who had initially categorized her somewhere between guest and servant and found the ambiguity professionally irritating, eventually settled on a kind of brisk, practical respect. The respect of one competent woman for another, which is perhaps the most reliable kind. Nobody called her Miss Vassell. She was the botanist to most of them, the foreign woman to the ones who were less inclined toward specificity. She answered to both. She did not think about what she answered to. She was working. The Duke came and went. October became November, became the long, slow dark of a northern December, and the library took shape around her in the way that large, complicated things take shape when you give them enough sustained attention, not all at once, but in sections, each piece of order revealing the logic of the next. By Christmas, she had catalogued her father's notebooks through 1802. By February, she had finished the greenhouse inventory and begun the cross-referencing that would eventually connect the physical specimens to the written records. She worked on the book in the early mornings, before the house woke. This was the part of the work she told no one about, partly because no one had asked, partly because it felt, still, like something fragile, the kind of thing that could be damaged by too much air. In March, the Duke returned from a 6-week absence in London and walked through the library on his way to the study beyond it, a route he occasionally used. She had noticed, when the main corridor was occupied with some domestic business, he preferred to avoid and stopped. The room had changed considerably since October. The crates were gone. The notebooks were arranged in the cases she had requested, built to her specification by the estate carpenter, a quiet man who had asked good questions and done excellent work. The specimens were housed in the long cabinets along the north wall, labeled, organized, cross-indexed. The central table held the current working materials, neatly arranged, with a logic that was invisible if you didn't know it and obvious if you did. The Duke stood in the middle of the room. She was at the far end at her desk, and she did not look up immediately. She had learned over months that looking up every time someone entered the library was a reliable way to lose her train of thought and gain very little in return. She finished her sentence. Then she looked up. He was looking at the specimen cabinets. Not casually, with the attention of someone actually examining something. He moved along them slowly, reading the labels, and she watched him understand what he was looking at. Not just a collection organized, but a collection made navigable, made useful, made into something that could actually be used rather than merely admired. He reached the end of the cabinets. He turned and found her watching him. She did not look away. She had stopped performing the kind of self-effacement that the house seemed to expect of her approximately 2 months in, when she had realized that it cost her something she could not afford to spend. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked through to the study without a word. She looked back at her notebook. She told herself it meant nothing. She was mostly right. Summer came, and with it a different quality of light through the library windows, fuller, more generous, lasting until 9 in the evening in a way that sometimes made her lose track of time entirely, looking up to find the whole day gone and the last of the sun just catching the top of the lime trees through the glass. She had begun to love this house. She had not intended to. She had intended to do her work and leave, finish the cataloging, make enough progress on the book to give it a fighting chance of completion, and return to the continent, where she had colleagues and a language that felt more natural in her mouth, and the possibility of a position that would acknowledge what she actually was rather than routing her through the kitchen garden. But the house had gotten into her the way places sometimes do, through the specific, accumulated details of daily life in them. Through Mossop's notes slid under the greenhouse door and Fell's conversation in the stable's yard, and the particular sound the library made at night when the fire had burned low and the wind came off the moors. Through the greenhouse at dawn, when the condensation on the glass caught the early light, and the rare specimen stood in the warm, damp air like something from a different world entirely, something her father had built over 40 years, and she was now, improbably, the custodian of. She walked the grounds in the evenings when the work was done. She told herself this was professional observation, monitoring, the kind of ongoing assessment that the garden required. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was, in some quiet way she had not fully named to herself, happy here. She saw the Duke in the garden once in August. She had not known he was in residence. He had arrived the previous evening. She learned later, returning unexpectedly from London for reasons the house did not share with her. She was at the far end of the grounds, near the old orchard, making notes on a variety of apple that Mossop believed was a heritage cultivar of some rarity, and she was beginning to agree with him. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, the main path, the one that ran through the formal garden which she was not on, and looked up. He was perhaps 30 yards away, walking with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man thinking hard about something that was not the garden. He had not yet seen her. She watched him without meaning to. He walked the length of the formal garden, the one she had been slowly restoring, bed by bed, over 8 months, the one that was beginning to look in sections like something again. He slowed as he passed the south-facing border which was the furthest along, the one where she had spent the most time. He stopped. He stood looking at it for a long moment, the salvaged roses, the replanted lavender, the edging she had re-established with the help of 2 reluctant undergardeners who had come around eventually. And she could not see his expression from this distance, but she could see, in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his stillness, that he was actually looking. Not the casual glance of a man passing through his own garden, something more careful than that. Then he moved on and she looked back at her notebook, and the moment passed. Later, she would think about it, about the way he had stood looking at something she had made and not known she had made it. Later, much later, she would understand that this was the closest they came, all summer, to a real conversation. The letter from Vienna arrived in September. She almost missed it. It had come through the solicitor, who had forwarded it to the Manor, and it sat for 3 days on the steward's desk before he thought to bring it to her. She was in the greenhouse when he found her, a small man moving carefully between the specimen benches with the expression of someone who is uncertain whether the news he is carrying is good or bad, and has decided neutrality is the safest position. She read it standing up, in the greenhouse, with the smell of damp earth around her and the sound of rain beginning on the glass overhead. Professor Heinrich Brandt, chair of the Department of Natural Sciences at the University of Vienna, wrote to inform her that the department was establishing a new publication series dedicated to foundational works in botanical science, and that her father's masterwork had been selected as the inaugural volume. They were aware the manuscript was unfinished. They were also aware, here she paused, and read the sentence again, that Miss Vassall had been working with the materials and was uniquely positioned to complete the work. They were offering her a formal research position, with full academic recognition to do so, in Vienna, beginning in the spring. She stood for a long time with the letter in her hands. The rain intensified on the greenhouse glass, a proper autumn rain now, the kind that settled in for days. One of the rare specimens dripped quietly from a leaf. Outside, beyond the glass, the garden she had spent a year restoring disappeared into gray. She thought about Vienna, the university building she had visited with her father as a child, enormous and serious and smelling of old paper. The colleagues there who knew her work, who had read the papers, who would call her Miss Vassal as a matter of course rather than as a remarkable novelty. The possibility of a life in which what she was matched what she was called. She thought about the book and what it would mean to finish it properly with the resources of a university behind her. She thought about the library, the greenhouse, the south-facing border in the formal garden, still mid-restoration, the second half of the work not yet done. She thought briefly and without intending to about a man standing on a gravel path in August, looking at something she had made. Then she folded the letter, put it in her pocket and went back to work. She had 3 months to decide. She decided in November. She was going. She wrote to Professor Brandt accepting the position. She wrote to the solicitor explaining the change. She began, quietly, to make the practical arrangements that leaving requires, the organization of her materials, the documentation of the work left unfinished, the notes for whoever came after her on the state of the greenhouse and the garden and the library cataloging system, written clearly enough that someone else could follow them. She did not tell the steward until December. He received the information with his customary neutrality and said he would inform His Grace. She nodded and returned to the library. That evening late, she sat at her desk with the last of the fire and looked around the room she had spent 14 months making into something. The cabinets along the north wall, the notebooks in their cases, the central table, clear now except for the current working materials, the book, which she would take with her, which was always going to come with her wherever she went. She felt not regret, something more complicated than regret. The particular feeling of leaving a place you have put yourself into, knowing that the place will remain and you will not, and understanding that this is correct and necessary and still, somehow, costs you something. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind off the moors and thought that in the spring she would be in Vienna, where the wind was different and the light was different and nobody would root her through a kitchen garden, and that this was what she had worked for and what she deserved and what she was going to do. She almost believed it. She was in the library on the last evening, packing the final box, when the door opened. She knew it was him before she looked up, not from any particular sound, but from the quality of the pause that preceded it, the specific hesitation of someone standing in a doorway deciding whether to enter. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with a book in his hand, one of hers, she realized, one of her father's notebooks, the 1798 volume that she had left on the corner of the desk that morning and had been meaning to pack. He had picked it up somewhere, from the desk perhaps if he had come in earlier when she wasn't here. He had been in the library then without her knowing. She looked at the notebook in his hand, then at him. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. The steward had told him then, or he had seen the boxes, or both. "Yes," she said. He looked at the room. At the boxes, the organized cases, the cabinets along the north wall. At the work of 14 months, which was ending because it was finished, because she had done what she came to do and then considerably more, and because there was a university in Vienna that wanted her name on a door. "When?" he said. "Friday. 3 days." He looked at her. Directly, in the way she had noticed he occasionally did, not the assessing glance of the front door, not the passing acknowledgement of the corridor, but actually looking, the kind that requires something from the person doing it. She met it steadily. "Vienna," he said, so he knew that too. "Yes," she said. A silence. It was not, she thought, a silence that wanted to be filled. It was the kind that has its own weight, that contains something neither party has said and both parties are aware of not saying. She had learned to recognize these silences over 14 months of living in a house with someone who generated them. She waited. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He set the notebook down on the corner of the desk, carefully, precisely, in almost exactly the position she had left it, and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I hope," he said, and stopped. She waited. He did not finish the sentence. He turned and left, and she listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and up the main staircase and disappear into the upper floors of the house. And she stood in the library with her half-packed box and the notebook on the corner of the desk and the particular specific ache of a sentence that has not been finished. She stood there for quite a long time. Then she picked up the notebook, wrapped it carefully, placed it in the box, and sealed it. Friday, she told herself. 3 days. The morning of her last full day, Sira rose before dawn. She did not need to. The packing was done: 3 boxes for the solicitor to forward, 1 trunk for the coach, the satchel she carried herself, always the way her father had carried it before her. Everything was arranged. Everything was finished. She rose anyway, dressed in the dark, and went to the greenhouse. She told herself it was professional, a final check. The notes she had left for whoever came next were thorough, but there were 1 or 2 specimens that required a particular kind of attention in winter. She told herself this, and it was true, and it was not the reason. The reason was simpler and less dignified. She was not ready to leave it. The greenhouse in the early morning was different from the greenhouse at any other hour, warmer than the air outside, the condensation on the glass catching the first gray suggestion of light, the smell of earth and green things dense and close in a way that always reminded her, with a force that had not diminished over 14 months, of her father's study in Bucharest. The smell of serious botanical work. The smell of her childhood. She moved through the benches slowly, touching nothing, just looking, the way you look at things you are committing to memory. The rare specimens stood in their careful arrangements, labeled in her handwriting, cross-referenced to the catalog she had built. Her father's work continued. His argument extended. The book, which was in the trunk, which was going to Vienna, which was going to be finished. She stood at the end of the central bench and looked at all of it. You would have liked this, she thought to her father, which was something she did occasionally and had stopped being embarrassed about. You would have liked this house, the library, Mossop. You would have found the Duke maddening and interesting in equal measure, which is what you found most people. She smiled at the condensation on the glass. I'm going to finish it, she told him. I promise. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Pale, tentative, the particular fragile gray of early winter dawn, the kind of light that makes everything look as though it is still deciding whether to exist. She took one more slow look at the greenhouse. Then she picked up her satchel, turned off the lamp, and went to pack the last of her things. The guests arrived at 11. She had not known there were going to be guests. The steward had not mentioned it, an oversight, she assumed. The kind of thing that happens when a household is simultaneously managing a departure and an arrival, and the 2 things exist in different categories that do not, in the steward's organizational system, naturally communicate with each other. She heard them from the library, where she was doing a final check of the catalog, 4 voices, the particular register of men who are comfortable with each other and in each other's company and have been for a long time. Laughter. The sound of the entrance hall receiving people, coats and boots, and the general noise of arrival. She heard the Duke's voice among them, different from how it was when he was alone in the house, easier, more expansive, the voice of a man in his own element. She stayed in the library. Lunch was in the dining room. She ate in the kitchen, as she always did, with Mrs. Price and 2 of the maids, and listened to the muffled sound of conversation from the floor above, which told her nothing specific and everything general, that the mood was good, that the conversation was animated, that whatever business had brought them here was going well. She thought about Friday. She thought about the coach, the road south, the Channel crossing, the long gradual shift of landscape as England gave way to the continent, and the continent gave way, eventually, to the specific geography of a life that made sense on paper. She was thinking about this when Polly, the youngest of the kitchen maids, appeared in the doorway with an expression that Sira had learned meant she had overheard something and was uncertain whether to share it. Sira looked at her. They're asking for port in the library, Polly said, in a little while. I'll clear my things from the table, Sira said. It's not. Polly stopped, smoothed her apron, started again. One of them, The tall one, the lord, he was asking about Blackwell, about the estate. And then he said, another stop. Sierra waited. He said your name, Polly said. Miss Vassal. He said it like he knew you, and his grace went very quiet. Sierra looked at her for a moment. Thank you, Polly, she said. She went back to the catalog. She heard them move to the library at 2:30. She was in the corridor outside. She had been going to the steward's office, a final errand, and she stopped when she heard them settle into the room, the sound of chairs and the particular acoustics of the library carrying further than the occupants perhaps realized. She should have continued to the steward's office. She stood in the corridor. She told herself later that she had not intended to listen. This was mostly true. She had intended to move on, and then she had heard her name, and she had not. It was said by a voice she didn't recognize, smooth, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms receiving his words well. Sierra Vassal. I had no idea she was here, Blackwell. Her father's work is considered foundational in half of Europe. Vassal's paper on altitude adaptation changed the entire conversation in Vienna, Prague, Paris. The appointment they've offered her is quite remarkable. You must be sorry to lose her. A pause. Foundational, the voice continued, and she could hear in it the particular quality of a man who is using a compliment as a blade. Rather extraordinary to have had someone of that caliber passing through the kitchen garden for the last year and a half. I wonder, did you know who she was when she arrived? The silence that followed was the longest she had heard in 14 months of learning this house's silences. It lasted 4 seconds. She counted. The Duke said, yes. One word flatly delivered. A lie she understood immediately and completely. Not an elaborate one, just the specific, reflexive lie of a proud man buying himself time. She knew the truth. She had always known the truth. She had been rooted through the kitchen garden on her first morning and called the botanist and the foreign woman for 14 months, and not once in all of that time had anyone said her name in his hearing. She had not been unknown to him. She had been no one to him. There was a difference. She stood in the corridor and held both of these things, the lie and the difference, and felt something that was not quite what she would have expected to feel. Not anger, though there was some of that, familiar and low-burning, the kind she had been living alongside for a long time. Not humiliation, though there was that too, the specific variety that comes from hearing yourself discussed as an oversight. Something else underneath those. Something that surprised her. Something that felt obscurely like grief. She turned and walked back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her packed trunk. Friday, she told herself. Tomorrow. She was at the tradesman's entrance at 8 the following morning. The coach was coming at 9. She had arranged it herself, 3 weeks ago, writing the letter with the brisk efficiency of someone who has learned to make their own arrangements because no one else is going to make them. She had 1 hour. She had said goodbye to Mrs. Price the previous evening. To Fell, who had shaken her hand with both of his and said she was welcome back any time, which was the warmest thing anyone at Blackwell Manor had said to her in 14 months and made her throat do something she chose not to examine. To Mossop, who had given her a packet of seeds from the kitchen garden, a heritage variety, carefully labeled in his scratched handwriting, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of warmth. She had not said goodbye to the Duke. She had not expected to. She came through the tradesman's entrance for the last time. She noted this the last time, with the deliberate attention she gave to last things, and came around the side of the house toward the front drive where the coach would arrive. The Duke was standing at the top of the front steps. She stopped. He was in his coat, no hat in the cold morning air, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen only a few times in 14 months, the one where he had stopped managing what his face was doing. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been awake for most of the night and had come to a conclusion he was not entirely certain how to deliver. Her trunk was already at the bottom of the steps. Someone had brought it around. She looked at the trunk, then at him. She began to walk toward the drive. Miss Vassal, she stopped. The name in his voice, her actual name, 2 syllables, said with the specific care of someone pronouncing something correctly for the first time, did something she had not prepared for. She turned. He came down 2 steps, stopped there, which put them closer to the same height than they usually were. She had always had to look up at him, in the library, in the garden, in the corridor, and she had never thought about this until now, when suddenly she didn't have to. She looked at him. "You know my name," she said. It came out very level. She was grateful for that. "I should have known it 2 years ago," he said. The morning air was cold and still around them. Somewhere in the kitchen garden, a bird was making its case for the day with considerable conviction. The lime trees at the end of the drive stood in the early light, enormous and patient, doing what lime trees do. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the tradesman's entrance, about the botanist and the foreign woman, and 4 seconds of silence in a library while a proud man decided how to answer a question about whether he had known who she was. She thought about a man standing in front of specimen cabinets in March, actually looking. A man stopping on a gravel path in August, standing still in front of something she had made. A man in a library doorway holding an unfinished sentence like something he didn't know how to put down. She thought about what he had said last night. Yes, flat and immediate, protecting something she understood now. Not himself, or not only himself. She thought about "I hope" and the sentence that had not been finished. She picked up her satchel. "Goodbye, Your Grace," she said. She walked to the drive. She did not look back. The coach arrived at 9 precisely. She got in. The door closed. The coach moved down the lime tree avenue, and she looked straight ahead at the road, at the gray morning, at the long way south. She did not cry. She was very, very careful not to think about the expression on his face. Vienna in the spring was everything she had told herself it would be. The university was serious and generous and full of people who said her name correctly and knew her father's work and asked her questions she had to think about before answering, which was her preferred kind of question. Professor Brandt was a small, energetic man in his 60s who treated her with the brisk, collegial respect of someone who has read your work and found it sound, which was the only kind of respect she had ever wanted. She had rooms near the university, small, clean, south-facing, with a window that caught the afternoon light in a way that was useful for working. She set up her materials in the first week, arranged her father's notebooks in their familiar order, made herself a cup of tea, and sat down at the desk that was hers in a building that had her name on a door. She worked. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The work was real and absorbing and important, the kind that fills the hours properly, that gives the day a shape worth having. She was, by any reasonable measure, doing exactly what she should be doing. She wrote to Mrs. Price at Christmas, a brief, warm letter with a packet of seeds enclosed, alpine varieties, difficult to source in England, that she thought Mossop would find interesting. Mrs. Price wrote back with news of the manor, the kitchen garden, the greenhouse, the south-facing border which was apparently thriving. She did not write to the Duke. She did not expect to hear from him. In February, she received a letter from the solicitor. She read it at her desk in the south-facing light, with her tea going cold beside her. The Duke of Blackwell, the letter informed her, had made a formal gift to the University of Vienna. The entirety of her father's physical collection, the specimens and pressed samples, and the remaining materials that she had not been able to bring with her, to be housed in the university's Natural Sciences Library as a permanent collection in the name of Dr. Konstantin Vasil, to support ongoing research in alpine botany. The gift was to be acknowledged in the university's records, the solicitor wrote carefully, as having been arranged at the specific request of Miss Sira Vasil, in recognition of her work in identifying and preserving the collection. Her name, on the record, correctly. She set the letter down. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. She sat for a long time looking at the window, at the Vienna rooftops, at the specific gray-blue of a February sky over a city that was not the English North and had a different quality of silence and a different quality of light and was. She had mostly managed to convince herself exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about 14 months, about a library made from chaos, about a greenhouse at dawn, about a kitchen garden in November and a first morning and a door that was the wrong door, about a man who had learned her name too late and had then, quietly, specifically, without requiring anything from her in return, done the only thing he could think of to use it correctly. She did not write back through the solicitor. She wrote directly. On page, formal, her handwriting, which was small and precise and European in a way that 14 months in England had not changed. Your Grace, I have received the solicitor's letter regarding the collection. I understand what you have done and why you have done it. My father would have been, I think the word is moved, though he would not have used it himself. He was not a man who admitted to being moved easily. I find that I have inherited this from him, among other things. The work continues well. As vassal, she sealed it before she could reconsider. She sent it. He wrote back in March. 2 pages which surprised her. She had expected 1, or perhaps nothing, had half prepared herself for nothing, had told herself that the gesture of the collection was complete in itself and required no continuation. 2 pages, in a hand that was larger and less precise than hers, the handwriting of someone who thinks faster than he writes. He wrote about the estate, the greenhouse, which the new under-gardener was managing conscientiously but without, the Duke wrote, what he could only describe as understanding. The south-facing border, which had come through the winter better than expected. The alpine strawberries on the north wall, which Mossop had apparently been tending with a devotion that the Duke found disproportionate, and the kitchen staff found entirely justified. He wrote about the book, had read, he said, her father's 1798 notebook, the one he had picked up the evening before she left, which he should perhaps have mentioned at the time but had not, for reasons he was not going to examine too closely in a letter. It is extraordinary work, he wrote. I am not a botanist. I understand perhaps a third of the technical content. But I can follow the argument, and the argument is, I think the word is beautiful, though I would not use it in company. She read that sentence 3 times. He wrote on the second page 2 paragraphs that were more careful than the rest, the handwriting slower, more deliberate, the kind of writing that has been restarted more than once. I owe you more than an apology. I understand that. I also understand that an apology delivered at a distance of several hundred miles and several months after the fact is a limited instrument. I am not writing to offer one, or not only to offer one. I am writing because I find, and I will ask you to forgive the directness, which I have concluded is more honest than the alternative, that I would like to continue writing to you if you are willing, not to resolve anything, simply because it turns out that I have a great deal to say to you and spent 2 years not saying any of it, and I find I am disinclined to continue in that pattern. You do not need to respond to this part of the letter if you would prefer not to. I will understand. She set the letter down on her desk. She looked at it. She picked up her pen. She put it down again. She stood up, went to the window, looked at the Vienna rooftops for a while, thought several things she was not going to write down, and then came back to the desk. She picked up the pen. Your Grace, she wrote, you may continue to write. S. Vassal. She sent it before she could add anything else. The letters continued through spring, then through summer. She began to look forward to them in a way she examined carefully and decided to simply accept, because she had spent enough of her life managing herself out of things that were inconvenient, and she was 30 years old and she was tired of it. He was, and this was the thing she had not expected, though perhaps she should have, given the evidence of 14 months at close range, genuinely interesting. Not in a performed way, not in the way of men who have decided to be interesting to a particular woman for a particular purpose. In the actual way, he had read widely and thought carefully about what he'd read. He had opinions he was willing to examine under pressure. He asked questions she had to think about. He was also, in letters, funny. Dryly, precisely, in a way that she suspected very few people got to see. She wrote back at length. She had not, she realized, had anyone to write to at length in a very long time. Her father had been her primary correspondent and had been dead for 2 years, and the void this had left in her daily life was one she had not fully accounted for until now, when it was being filled by someone she had not anticipated. She told him about the book, the progress of it, the difficulties, the particular challenge of finishing another person's argument while remaining faithful to it. He asked good questions about this. Not botanical questions. He did not pretend to expertise he didn't have, but structural ones. Questions about argument and evidence and the problem of knowing when a thing is finished. How will you know, he wrote in July, when it is complete? She thought about this for a week before answering. When the argument holds, she wrote back. When there are no remaining loose ends, no threads I have left deliberately untidy because I wasn't sure what to do with them. When I can read it from the beginning and find nothing that is there because I was afraid to remove it or not there because I was afraid to add it. When it is honest. A pause of 10 days. Then, that is the most useful definition of finished I have ever encountered. I am going to apply it to several other things. She smiled at that letter for longer than she intended to. In September, a year after she had left, he wrote to tell her he was coming to Vienna. He was matter-of-fact about it, a business matter, an introduction Professor Brandt had apparently facilitated, something to do with funding for the natural sciences collection that she did not entirely follow and suspected was not entirely the point. I will be there for a week, he wrote. I would like to see you if you are willing. Not to resolve anything, he wrote again, the same phrase as before, simply to continue the conversation in a format that doesn't require waiting 10 days for a reply. She read this letter at her desk in the south-facing light, with her tea, which she had learned to drink while it was still hot. She thought about a cold stone floor and a tradesman's entrance, and 2 years of being no one in a house she had loved. She thought about specimen cabinets in March and alpine strawberries in November, and an unfinished sentence in the dark. She thought about 2 pages of careful handwriting and a year of letters and the specific, unexpected texture of a mind she had come to know well without quite meaning to. She picked up her pen. I am willing, she wrote. I should tell you there is a door at the university. My name is on it. I will expect you to use it. She sent it. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the Vienna rooftops and thought that some things, maybe, could be restarted from the correct door. He arrived on a Tuesday. She was in her office, her name on the door just as she had written in clean institutional lettering that she had not yet stopped finding quietly extraordinary when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Unhurried, certain. The footsteps of a man who has never walked into a space and wondered whether he belonged there, though she had come to understand over a year of letters that this was not quite as simple as it looked from the outside. A knock. Come in, she said. He opened the door and stood in it, and she looked at him across the distance of the office, her books, her desk, her father's notebooks in their ordered cases along the wall, and he looked at her, and there was a pause, not an awkward one, the kind that has its own weight. He looked around the room, at the notebooks, at the work arranged on the desk, at her name on the door which he would have seen from the corridor. Something moved in his expression. Miss Vassil, he said, her name, correctly. As though he had been practicing, and perhaps she thought he had. Your Grace, she said. He stepped into the room. He did not, she noticed, wait to be invited, but he left the door open, which was its own kind of correctness, the specific consideration of a man who is aware of the difference between confidence and presumption, and is trying carefully to stay on the right side of it. She stood up from her desk. They looked at each other across the room she had made in the city she had chosen, on the other side of the door with her name on it. You came a long way, she said. Yes, he said, for a business matter. A pause, something adjacent to a smile. Among other things, she looked at him for a moment, then she picked up her coat from the hook behind the door. There is a very good coffee house, she said, 2 streets from here. The owner knows my father's work, which means he treats me well, which means the table by the window is usually available. She looked at him. I thought we might start there. He held the door for her. She walked through it. 2 years later, the gathering at Blackwell Manor was Sira's idea, which meant it was organized with a precision that the estate had not previously experienced and would likely not recover from for some time. The invitations had gone out in September, formal, specific, the kind that tell you exactly where to be and when and leave no room for the pleasant vagueness that English country gatherings usually relied upon. Each invitation had included, tucked inside, a single pressed alpine flower from her father's collection, a small thing, unnecessary, entirely her own addition, which she had done at midnight the week before while the Duke sat across the table from her pretending to read and occasionally watching her work with the expression she had come to think of as his most honest one. He had not asked why she was pressing flowers into envelopes at midnight. He had simply, at some point, put down his book and helped her fold them. This was, she had found, characteristic of him. He had learned over 2 years of letters and 1 year of marriage that her conclusions were usually worth following, and he had applied this understanding practically, which meant that he was frequently to be found doing things he could not have explained the purpose of, and had not asked the purpose of and would, if pressed, admit had turned out to be exactly right. The guest list was 43 people, which was not large by the Manor's standards but was, as Sira had explained, exactly the right number. He had agreed without argument. He agreed with her quite often now. The gathering was for the botanical sciences. Specifically for the publication of the book, her father's masterwork, completed bound, printed by the university press in Vienna and dedicated, in the front matter, to Dr. Konstantin Vasil, who began this argument, and to everyone who helped his daughter finish it. She had written that dedication 6 times. The first version had been longer, more specific, more grateful, more careful to name the things and people that deserved naming. The second had been shorter, cleaner, a little cold. The third had tried to split the difference and succeeded at neither. By the 6th she had understood that what she was trying to say was simple, and that simple required courage rather than craft, and she had written it in 1 sentence and sent it to the printer before she could reconsider. The copy that arrived from Vienna had been opened in the greenhouse, alone, before anyone else was awake. She had sat on the potting bench with the bound volume in her hands and read the dedication, and then the first page, and then the last, and then she had sat for a while in the damp morning warmth with her father's life's work in her lap, and said nothing to anyone, because there was nothing to say that the work itself didn't already say better. Then she had put it down, gone inside, made tea, and gotten on with the day. The guests were scientists, mostly botanists, naturalists, 2 cartographers, a geologist from Prague who had corresponded with her father for 30 years and wept openly when she handed him a copy, which she had not anticipated and which had required her to look at the ceiling for a moment and think about soil composition until she was certain her face was doing what she needed it to do. The oldest guest was 81. He had worked with her father in the Alps in 1801 and had traveled 3 days to be here and had said, when she met him at the door, that Konstantin would have been insufferably pleased with himself, which was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her father in 2 years and had made her laugh properly for the first time all week. She had put him in the best guest room. Professor Brandt was in the second best, a fact he had not yet discovered, and which Sira intended to keep from him for as long as professionally possible. Lord Ashby had arrived with his wife the previous evening. Sira had thought carefully about whether to invite him. She had thought about it for 3 days in October, alone in the greenhouse, turning it over with the same methodical attention she gave to things she wasn't certain about. He was the Duke's oldest friend, or nearest to it. Their friendship was the complicated kind, the kind built on too much history to simply set aside, with enough genuine regard underneath the history to make setting it aside a loss rather than a relief. He had apologized to her in London 6 months ago over dinner. Briefly, specifically, without ornamentation or self-justification, which had surprised her, and without requiring her to respond in any particular way, which had surprised her more. She had accepted it in the same spirit, and they had talked, for the remainder of the evening, about other things entirely. She was not someone who held things longer than they were useful. She had invited him. He had arrived and immediately begun a conversation with her husband about land drainage that had lasted, at last count, 2 hours, and appeared to be of genuine mutual interest on both sides. She had passed them in the corridor before dinner, and heard enough to confirm that the conversation was real, not performed for her benefit, not careful, simply two men talking about something they both cared about, and had felt something she recognized as relief, quiet and clean. Some things repaired themselves, given enough time and the right kind of not forcing. She had learned this from plants, among other places. The morning of the gathering she rose before dawn. She went to the greenhouse first, as she always did, the habit of 3 years now, the fixed point around which the day arranged itself, as immovable as the building itself. She had a key on a ribbon that she wore around her wrist when she slept, which the Duke had found when they were first married, and which he had looked at for a long moment and said nothing about, which was exactly the right response. She moved through the benches in the early dark, the lamp in her hand casting its small circle of warm light on the specimen benches, the labeled jars, the careful system she had built and extended and continued to extend. The rare specimens stood as they always stood, patient, particular, asking nothing except the right conditions and consistent attention, which she gave them. 3 years of this, and beyond the original collection now, the work she had continued and expanded, the correspondence with growers in Vienna and Prague, and the woman in Budapest who was doing extraordinary things with high-altitude germination that nobody else had thought to try, and who had become, over 18 months of letters, something approaching a friend. Sira did not make friends quickly or carelessly. The ones she made she kept. She stood at the end of the central bench. She thought about her father. She thought about him here specifically, in this greenhouse, in this light, surrounded by the work of his life that she had carried across a continent and organized and continued. She thought about what he would have said. He had not been a sentimental man. He had been a precise man, which is different. Sentimentality blurs, precision sharpens, and what he had taught her above all else was to look at things clearly and say what she saw. He would have looked at the collection and said, "Good." He would have looked at the book and said, "Better than I expected," which means you understood it. He would have looked at her, at this life, this house, this morning, and he would have been quiet for a while, and then he would have said something she couldn't predict, because he had always surprised her, and she had always been grateful for it. She missed him with the clean, settled grief of someone who has had enough time to understand that grief and gratitude are not opposites, that you can hold both without one canceling the other, that missing someone is simply the shape love takes when it has nowhere left to go. "I finished it," she told him. "Come and look." Outside, the dawn was arriving over the moors in the particular way of northern winter dawns, slowly, without drama, the darkness simply becoming less dark until suddenly there was light. The kitchen garden emerged from the gray, frosted and still. The lime tree avenue appeared, the old trees enormous and patient in the early cold. The south-facing border stood in the formal garden, its winter arrangement precise and deliberate, the seed heads catching what little light there was. She had finished that too. The second half she had left undone on the morning she drove away, the beds half restored, the structure incomplete, the argument of the garden not yet made, had taken another year to finish. She and Mossop, working alongside each other in the way they had always worked, without unnecessary words, with enormous mutual respect, with the shared understanding of two people who see the same things in a piece of ground and agree on what it needs. Mossop had retired in October at 71 to a cottage on the estate that the Duke had arranged without being asked, because he was, when it came to the people Sira valued, quietly and consistently good. She had written Mossop's reference herself, 3 pages, specific, honest, and he had read it in the kitchen with Mrs. Price and been silent for a long time, and then said it was acceptable. She had known what he meant. She missed him on mornings like this, in the garden, when she noticed something that deserved to be noticed, and there was no one standing beside her who would understand it in quite the same way. She thought he would have liked today. The guests assembled in the library at 11. 43 people in the room she had built, the specimen cabinets along the north wall, the notebooks in their ordered cases, the central table set with copies of the book in the particular arrangement she had spent 20 minutes perfecting the previous evening, while her husband watched from the doorway with the expression of a man who has learned that 20 minutes is a reasonable price for perfection and has adjusted his expectations accordingly. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them all, 43 people, 4 countries, her father's work on the table between them. She had prepared her remarks carefully and had then, that morning in the greenhouse, put the prepared version away and decided to speak plainly instead. Her father had always spoken plainly. It was one of the things that had made him difficult at dinner parties and essential in a laboratory, and she had inherited it, and she had stopped apologizing for it some time ago. She spoke for 25 minutes. She spoke about her father first, about the man rather than the scientist, which was the right order, because the man had made the scientist and the scientist had made the work, and the work was what they were here for. She spoke about what it was like to grow up alongside 40 years of a single argument, to learn to see altitude and adaptation before you could read, to understand that patience was not passivity, but the most active thing a botanist could practice, to watch a brilliant man look at a flower on a mountainside, and understand something about the relationship between pressure and survival that most people would spend their lives missing. She spoke about finishing the argument, about what it had cost and what it had required and what it had given her, which was more than she had anticipated in both directions, harder and richer than she had known when she began. She spoke about the collection, about what it meant to preserve something that had almost been lost. She knew how close it had come. She knew what it had taken to carry it across a continent in a leather satchel and organize it in a library in a house where she entered through the wrong door and build it into something that 43 people from 4 countries had traveled to see. She delivered this as fact, because it was fact, and because she was a precise woman, and because precision was the highest form of respect she knew how to offer. She did not speak about tradesmen's entrances. She did not speak about kitchen gardens or cold stone floors or the particular quality of an October morning 3 years ago when she had stood at the top of a gravel drive and understood, for the first time, exactly where she stood in the world of this house. Those things were not in the scientific record. But she thought about them, briefly in the pause before she concluded, thought about all of it, the whole long chain of it, the wrong door and the 2 years and the name said too late, and the letters and the slow, patient, necessary work of building something real from materials that were not, initially, the right materials. And then she let it go, the way you let go of the things that have made you, with recognition and without clinging, because you are no longer carrying them. Because they have already done everything they were going to do. She looked at the room. She said, "Thank you." The room applauded. Afterward, in the garden, the day had resolved into something unexpectedly generous, cool, clear, the light at that particular angle of late November that makes everything look both very old and very new at the same time. The guests moved through the formal garden in groups, along the paths she knew by heart, some drifting toward the greenhouse where Professor Brandt had stationed himself with the proprietary confidence of a man who has decided the collection is partly his responsibility, which it was not, and partly his pride, which Sira had decided to allow. She stood at the far end of the south-facing border and watched them, her guests, her garden, her father's day. The border stood in its winter arrangement, the structure she had designed over 2 years, the bones of it visible now that the growing season was done, the geometry of it clear in the cold light. It was, she thought, her best work in this garden. Not the most dramatic, the greenhouse held more rarities, the kitchen garden was more useful but the truest. The one that looked most like what she had seen when she first arrived, the buried potential of a neglected space, and had spent 3 years making actual. She heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She did not turn around. She knew his footsteps the way she knew the sound of the greenhouse in the wind, the way she knew the particular creak of the library door by accumulated, specific, intimate familiarity, the kind that only comes from long attention to a particular thing. He stopped beside her. They stood together and looked at the border in the afternoon light, and she felt the warmth of him beside her in the cold air, and thought about how strange it was, how continuously, quietly strange, to be a person who once stood in a kitchen garden in October with 11 pounds and 4pence to her name, and is now standing here in this with him. Not strange in a way that required resolution. Strange in the way of gifts, inexplicable, unearned, to be received with both hands open. "Brant," he said after a moment, "has told me that the greenhouse is the finest private collection in England. He told me that too, in slightly more words. He used the phrase staggering breadth. He also said the temperature regulation in the east section needs attention. I know, I have already spoken to Fenwick about it." She looked at him. "I listened," he said, with the moderate defensiveness of a man making a reasonable point. "You mentioned it in September." She looked back at the border. He had listened in September. He had listened, she had come to understand, with more attention than he generally advertised, filing things away, noting them, acting on them quietly, the way he had arranged the cottage for Mossop without being asked, or arranged the Vienna collection without requiring thanks or written, 2 pages at a time, the letters that had constituted, she understood now, the longest and most serious conversation she had ever had with anyone. He was not, she had found, an easy man to know. He was an honest one, which was rarer and worth more. "The 81-year-old, she said. "Hartman, he told me this morning that my father was insufferably pleased with himself." A pause. "Is that a compliment?" From Hartman, "Yes, unambiguously." "Good." Another pause. "He also told me over breakfast that you have your father's eyes and your mother's stubbornness, and that the combination is formidable." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you tell him I never knew my mother?" "I told him that made the stubbornness all the more impressive, since it was apparently self-generated." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one, the one that appeared when he had stopped arranging his face into anything in particular, and was simply looking at her, openly, in the way that had made her uncomfortable at first, and now made her feel something she had no more precise word for than home. She looked back at the border. "He told me something else," her husband said after a moment. "Hartman?" "Yes," he said, a pause, the careful pause of a man choosing words. "He said that Constantine used to speak of you, when they corresponded. He said your father wrote about you the way men write about the things they are most proud of and most frightened for. He said he always wanted to meet you." Sierra looked at the seed heads in the low light. At the structure of the border, the bones of it, the thing she had built from a neglected bed and 3 years of patient attention. She thought about her father's letters, which she had, all of them, kept in the tin box that now sat on the shelf in the library, not under a floorboard, on a shelf, visible, the way things should be when you no longer need to hide them. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "You've said that before. It becomes more true as time passes." She glanced at him. "That is not entirely a compliment." He acknowledged this with the slight inclination of his head that she had learned meant fair enough, a gesture she had taken 3 months to decode, and now read as fluently as his handwriting, which she still found too large and insufficiently precise, and had told him so, and which he had shown absolutely no intention of improving. He found her hand, as he always did, without looking for it. She let her fingers close around his, warm, certain, the gesture of 2 people who have gotten used to each other at a cellular level, the kind of getting used to that cannot be hurried or manufactured, that simply accumulates, day by day, like all the slow and necessary things. The guests drifted inside as the light failed. She and her husband stayed in the garden a little longer, not for any particular reason, simply because neither of them moved, and neither of them wanted to, and they had both learned, in their separate and then shared lives, to pay attention to the moments that don't require anything from you, because those are sometimes the ones worth most. The lime tree avenue darkened at the far end of the garden. The kitchen garden went gray. The border stood in the last of the light, the seed head still, the structure clear and clean, and exactly what she had intended it to be when she began. She looked at it and thought, finished. Not in the sense of done, nothing she cared about was ever simply done, but in the sense she had written to him about in the second year of letters when he had asked how she would know. When the argument holds, when there are no remaining loose ends, when it is honest, it held. It was honest. She had built it from a neglected border and 3 years of work, and a knowledge of plants and their particular requirements that she had spent her whole life accumulating. And it was what she had seen when she arrived, made actual, made real, made lasting. She thought this was probably true of more than the garden. She thought this was probably true of most things she had built in this place, from the collection and the book to the particular, complicated, entirely unprecedented fact of this life. This man, this house, this morning, these 43 people from 4 countries inside drinking her husband's wine and arguing about botany in the warm room she had made her own. All of it built from what was available. All of it, in the end, holding. That evening, after the last guests had gone to their rooms and the house had settled into its late-night quiet, she went to the library. She did it without planning to, or she told herself that, though she thought perhaps some part of her had been moving toward it all day, the way you move toward the things that matter, not always directly but always eventually. The fire was low. 1 lamp still burned on the desk. The room was warm and close and exactly itself. The specimen cabinets along the north wall, the notebooks in their cases, the long table cleared now of the afternoon's copies, just the one she had left in the corner. She stood in the middle of the room. She had stood in this exact spot in her first week, overwhelmed by the scale of the work, the crates, the chaos, the 40 years of her father's life requiring her to make sense of them. She had stood here in the middle of a very cold December and looked at what she had cataloged and understood for the first time, that she was going to be able to do it. She had stood here on a March morning and watched the Duke look at what she had made and turn and leave without a word and felt, beneath the familiar sting of invisibility, something that she had not, then, known what to do with. She stood here now and looked at the room, which was hers. She crossed to the desk and picked up the copy of the book. Her copy. Her name beneath her father's on the title page in clean institutional type, completed and edited by Cira Vassel, University of Vienna, which she had read and reread in the greenhouse that first morning and which still, 3 weeks later, arrived in her awareness with a small, fresh shock of reality. She opened it to the dedication. Dr. Konstantin Vassel, who began this argument, and to everyone who helped his daughter finish it. She read it once. She thought about everyone. About what everyone meant and who everyone was and the long, unlikely chain of things and people, and wrong doors and right letters that had led to this room. This book. This particular November evening with 43 scientists in the guest rooms, and frost on the kitchen garden, and a man somewhere upstairs who had learned her name too late and spent every day since making certain he never forgot it. She closed the book. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back on the corner of the desk, precisely, in the spot she had put it that morning, and looked at it for a moment, this thing that was finished, that held, that was honest, that was done. She turned off the lamp. She went upstairs through the dark house, which was hers, up the staircase with its familiar creak at the 4th step, along the corridor with its smell of old wood and cold night air coming in at the window. She always left slightly open because she had grown up with her father's greenhouse smell and needed air to sleep. and into the room where her husband was reading and looked up when she came in with the expression, that particular, unguarded expression, that she had first seen on a gravel drive on a cold morning and had been trying, ever since, to deserve. She sat on the edge of the bed. He put down his book. "Well," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the book on the corner of the desk in the dark library, about 43 people in 4 countries and a pressed alpine flower in an envelope at midnight and an 81-year-old man who had said insufferably pleased with himself and meant it as the highest praise. She thought about a tradesman's entrance, about how far it was from there to here, and what the distance had cost and what it had made, and whether if she could go back to the beginning, to the cold October morning and the wrong door and the 11 pounds and 4pence, she would change any of it. She found she could not answer that cleanly. She found she did not need to. "It was a good day," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression, honest, open, entirely his. "Yes," he said, "it was." She reached over and turned off his lamp. Outside, the moors were dark and cold and exactly themselves, and the house settled around them both, quiet and patient and full, in every room and corridor and frost-touched garden, of the particular, accumulating warmth of a life that has been, one careful thing at a time, made right. Thank you for staying with the story until the very end. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.